If you dance this waltz, I will spare your life." The words drop into the ballroom, like a coin into a fountain, cold, deliberate, and watched by 100 glittering eyes. Amphitheater light fractures on crystal chandeliers that hang like fallen stars above the Blackwell estate. Silk and perfume press close. Laughter masks the razor edges beneath. Amelia Santos stands at the lip of that light, a maid in plain black between columns of marble, feeling the room measure her as if she were a thing on display. Her feet are bare. They are small, calloused at the heels, inked with the faint map of a life that learned to slip and steal quiet moments. A stolen piece of bread, a sheltered corner of warmth, a secret lesson with a woman who smelled faintly of jasmine and soap and old pages. Amelia remembers that scent like a compass. She remembers her grandmother's hands, the way Helena's knuckles opened like a gate and closed again on nothing. "Dancing doesn't live in your feet," Helena had said, low and fierce as if teaching a child to survive. "It lives in your soul." She had repeated it enough times that the phrase lodged into her ribs. It was ridiculous, poeticella luxury for people who could afford a pianist and a ballroom. And yet, when Cassian Blackwell's voice threaded through the music and the servants' murmurs, the phrase rose like a tide, and Amelia felt, absurdly, that Helena's lesson had been waiting in her all along. Cassian stands at the head table, carved from shadow and light. He is 36 tonight, the birthday crown polished with champagne, and the cruelty of a man who learned to wear power like a second skin. His smile is patient, practiced, a blade sheathed in manners. He is a study in cultivated indifference, scented, armored, with the architecture of a man who expects the world to yield. He had ordered it this spectacle. A birthday jest, he called it, and the room had obliged with the polite violence of a society accustomed to spectacle. A maid who dares the dance. It was meant to be a lesson for others. Your place, your limits, your appetite for humiliation. Amelia had been grabbed from the scullery while she was stacking china. Fingers that smelled faintly of alcohol and old money had clipped around her wrist like a She had been dragged. Not hurt, there are worse ways to be moved. They had dressed her in a borrowed frock. Someone had pinned a small, heavy necklace at her throat. 2 half-moons of metal, joined by a fragile clasp hand, told her she looked presentable enough. She had walked under the chandeliers, and felt each star's reflection cut a bright line across the floor. She had seen Cassian's eyes fall to the right side of her neck, and not, for once, with the hunger of ownership, but with the interest of someone who recognizes a pattern. "Do it," he had said. "One waltz. Amuse-me." She had measured him then, whose hands had ordered the room and whose shoulders braced the joke that made the servants shuffle like chessmen. She had measured the noise and the proximity of the exits. She had measured the men in the dark at the margin, security, whispers, the lieutenant who never blinked. She had measured the one thing they could not measure, the memory that unrolled inside her chest at the first note of a piano. When Maestro Julian Crane took up the piece, the world narrowed to the length of its single melody. He did not play the standard waltz. His hands, which had once rested on Raphael Crane's long-dead colleague's bench and learned to coax grief into music, found a strain that opened like a door in Amelia's memory and let the light of another room fall across her mind. The wooden floor of Helena's kitchen came back to her in a shimmer. A single patch of worn grooves where their feet had turned 1,000 times. The skein of sunlight across a table where bread had been split. The distant sound of a taxi, because once they had gone into town and the world had felt bigger than their apartments allowed. Helena's voice threaded through all of it. "Remember the first step, Maya." Always the first step. Maya had been her childhood name, now a barred and secret thing. Amelia stepped forward because she had to, not because she expected mercy. She had known there was no mercy here, but because the demand had hit some old remnant of pride and made it burn. The room leaned in. Hundreds of eyes sought the spectacle. She could feel them cataloguing her scars, faint ridges beneath her collarbone, the flattened seam along one wrist, the map of old bruises ghosting her thighs. They catalogued her the way keepers evaluate artifacts. Interesting, useful, replaceable. The music catches her like a tide. She breathes in time and lets her body remember. Her shoulders drop, and the world contracts to the space between her and the conductor. She moves. The waltz is not for the room. It is for the hollow that Helena left and the small, stubborn thing she carries that refuses to be made small. On the floor, Amelia begins to dance as if calling ghosts. Her arms make a history. Her feet know how to arc apology into pride and shame into rhythm. Each turn is a sentence. Her breaths punctuate them. The room makes ready to laugh. They do not, when she opens into the second phrase. There is a moment when the light seems to tilt an adjustment of the world to the truth she has always carried. Maestro, Julian freezes for one measure. He drops the tempo, and the orchestra follows him as if he were a captain turning a ship. The music takes on a different weight, a private cadence, and his face lined in the way of men who have played through joy and funeral both folds into something like recognition. The sheet music on his stand trembles. His knuckles whiten. He calls the melody with the gentleness of a confession. It is a strain that Helena had liked. He remembers the phrase Raphael had written in margins of his scores. Julian had danced with Raphael once in a hallway full of cigarette smoke and the smell of strong coffee. He'd heard Helena hum that tune between chores. The room shifts. A man at the bar squeezes his wife's hand. Someone takes a photograph. Amelia's name is not known to them. The melody is a painting on the far wall, hung in the place of honor, winks in the candlelight. A portrait of a woman in a blue dress with jasmine tucked at her throat. The pose is familiar. The jawline is familiar. Something in Amelia feels the painting like a hand on a shoulder. She had seen the face before, in a faded photograph that used to sit by the church's old heater. A picture Helena had kept folded in the Bible. This is not a surface coincidence. The portrait is painted with the same stubborn dignity Helena had forced into her features. Julian's eyes fall to Amelia for one long beat. He has seen the necklace at her throat, heavier than the costume should allow. He remembers a small bronze half a crescent of metal the size of a fingernail, warm in Helena's palm once. He remembers tucking the matching half into a little wooden box given to him by Raphael before he left the city to tend to an illness that would take him away. The two halves had meant something then, a promise between two families, a private claim that belonged to people who loved in quiet. Julian does not rise mid-performance. He turns the melody under his fingers like turning a key. The tune does what it is meant to do. It surfaces memory. The orchestra swells and Amelia spins. She does not see Julian's lips move, forming a name. She cannot see the tear that goes down his cheek. The room is still and small as a coin when the last chord drops. Silence has a shape. It fills the chandeliers, the tablecloths, the breaths. A glass tips on the periphery and rings, a sound small enough to be obscene. A woman at the next table covers her mouth. No one laughs. Cassian sits very still, and all the control that wraps him like an exoskeleton starts to show the seams. Someone clears their throat. The lieutenant at Cassian's shoulder shifts his weight. The camera phones flutter like moths, trying to catch a spark. It is the exact moment a truth begins to fold the room in on itself, like a map with one corner suddenly marked. Amelia comes to a stop. Her chest is damp under the borrowed frock. The collar of her dress clings. She bows because that is what dancers do. But her bow is not one of supplication. It is the polite iron exchange of someone who has reclaimed a small authority. She looks out and meets a face in the crowd that makes the world tilt. A weathered man at the back, whose eyes hold recognition like a ledger. His hand trembles over his napkin. When the applause comes, it is complicated, half for spectacle, half for the man who had the audacity to make something private into a public atrocity. But underneath, there is a thread of something different. Curiosity. Something has been said that the room could not translate, like a foreign phrase that kept repeating its rhythm until someone understood. Amelia slips off the stage when the crowd thins and sets to work masking the tremor in her hands with the pragmatic movement of a woman who has learned to tidy up other people's chaos. She is no longer alone in the orbit of recognition. A steward offers her his arm with a smile that is too tight. He murmurs that the boss liked the performance. Cassian watches, the steady observation of a man cataloging a newly inconvenient variable. Outside the windows, the estate's gardens breathe under the moon. Amelia steps into cool air, the jasmine in the hedges folding like memory against the night. She presses fingertips against the crescent at her throat, feeling the seam where it had once come undone. It is a relic of Helena's habit of tucking things where they could not easily be found. A coin, a note, one half of an old promise. The painting, the melody, the necklace, they are small things, but together they begin to make a logic that is dangerous. Julian slips out of the hall with the care of a man who realizes his fingers may be stained with history. He keeps to the shadows and walks the corridors of the house with the memory of a different life, like a stick in his hands. In an empty study, he opens a lockbox that no one expects him to touch. Inside, among ashmeared envelopes and brittle programs, rests a small velvet pouch. He slides his palm into it and comes up with a matching crescent of metal. His breath leaves him in a quiet church of sound. The night is a hinge. In the manor's private wing, Cassian returns to a world of papers and rooms sealed behind oak. He had intended the spectacle to be a trivial pleasure, a way to stitch the crowd's attention to his name and keep them from looking at the things that mattered. But the way Julian faltered under the melody compels him to do something he has not done in years. He goes alone to his father's study. Victor Blackwell's portrait sits over the fireplace, stern as an accusation. Cassian stands and looks at it, listening for the father he remembers and the one the portrait claims. The safe in Victor's desk is old-fashioned down oval of steel with a dial impractical, sentimental. He knows the combination. He has worn the knowledge like a key since he was young enough to be punished for curiosity. He turns the dial and the door opens with a sigh that sounds like a confession. Inside are files, stacked and labeled with years and names. There are letters in a precise hand and a battered leather ledger that smells faintly of smoke and money. Cassian lifts the ledger and flips toward the back. Names tumble like a scatter of leaden coins. He reads dates and entries that have been kept as if they were ledgers of SIM payments, transfers, aliases. The Blackwell fortune, as he has known it, rests on a map of transactions that do not belong to it. There is a photograph taped to one of the last pages. A woman in a blue dress, jasmine tucked to her collarbone. Her face bears a defiance that is strangely cavalier. In a child's photograph, the same face Amelia saw in the grand portrait. Below it, in a cramped, furious handwriting, is a name, Helena Valdez. Under the name, a second line, a date, and then a single word that slides like a blade. Claimed. The ledger smells like funeral smoke and cheap cologne. Cassian presses his thumb into the corner of it and finds himself somewhere he does not understand. He has known for years that the family business benefited from dirty hands. One learns that in the glow of inherited wealth, but this ledger speaks of something else, of coordinated theft, of papers signed in secrecy, of a man named Edward Blackwell making decisions as if his ledger were God. Raphael Crane appears in a set of loose documents as notes, a letter asking for a meeting, a name crossed out and replaced by an order. Cassian reads and feels the room spin. There is mention of Victor's attempt to halt a transfer one line where his father had argued desperately against the redirection of funds out of a trust that had been set aside for Valdez family properties. There are invoices stamped with dates that match the disappearance of several small businesses in the Valdez quarter. And there is a note written in his father's hand and then annotated by another. More clinical handwriting. If discovered, remove Victor. Cassian's chest tightens with the chill of betrayal. The ledger becomes a mirror in which he sees not the man he had been taught to be the heir. The director but the son of a man who stared at his conscience and chose the ledger's weight over his son's future. There is a photograph torn out of an album. A corner of serviceable paper with a child's face, his own in a crowd. Underneath, in an older Shakir hand, is a line. Watch the boy. He will inherit the house. He must not inherit the shame. In the study's hush, he hears the echo of the waltz. He hears Helena's name like a bell. He sees in the ledger a pattern, the merging of two secrets into a single strategy. His family had not simply profited, they had appropriated. They had taken titles, turned deeds into certificates, erased records. In the margins are copies of schematics and a list of properties marked with dates of acquisition. The ledger's logic is simple and savage. He closes the safe with hands that feel foreign. For a moment, the old defiant refuge of denial flares there. Are always plausible ways to rearrange a history to protect oneself. But Cassian is not a man who evades reality when it shows up at his door with facts. He is the product of a house that loves to self. He is also, in private and shame, the son who once watched his father cry. He had believed those tears were not admission but strategy. Now the ledger suggests otherwise. In a room far from the ballroom, Victoria Blackwell reads the minute details of the night's reverberations with the measurement of a storm chaser. She is the sister who has learned to sharpen herself into useful implements, useful in boardrooms, useful in betrayal. Victoria watches Cassian with hungry calculation. The mention of a maid's dance and an old melody is a threat to the narrative she has been building, that the Blackwells are immaculate, their ascendancy ordained. If Amelia's small display opens cracks, Victoria knows how to widen them to satisfy her hunger for the main stage. She calls a few favors on an unadorned phone, and makes arrangements with the coolness of someone who has always believed that power is a thing to be administered. If a threat exists, she will need to corral it. She thinks of Margaret, the matriarch, as both fulcrum and weakness. She thinks of public gestures, of private removals. Her mind is a ledger with a different alphabet. Amelia, meanwhile, goes back to her chores because that is what is expected. She stacks chairs and hides the trembling of her hands under the motion of wiping away fingerprints. She is small and careful, and her strength is made of repeated small acts. Yet things will not settle. Julian's confession, which is not yet voiced aloud, remains like a lit match in a dry house. The necklace at her throat is heavier now, with the possibility that it is not mere family jewelry, but a token cut into two, one half lost, the other found. If Helena and the Valdez lineage means something bigger than the memory of the kitchen floor, then Amelia is no longer only a maid. There are people who notice these small revolutions. Rico Santos, the uncle who had looked after Amelia for the first years after Helena's funeral, keeps a watch. He had seen Amelia disappear into the system's teeth when she was 17 and had done what he could. A donation here, an anonymous payment there, but family and poverty make strange bargains. He has always suspected that Blackwells took more than property. He has a list of grievances stacked in a drawer that no one would read and that the law could not always untangle. He sees the waltz through a different lens, as the first small opening of an old wound. That same night, in the quiet of the house that was both gilded cage and business hub, Cassian opens another drawer and finds what he had not expected: an envelope that had his name on it in a child's handwriting. It is a letter from Victor to him, written when Cassian was barely old enough to understand the altar of power. It is not a simple instruction. It is an attempt at apology. His father's pen has confessed fear and hinted at theft without the courage to name it. In the corner, in the margin, a scribble: if they come for the house, believe their story, not the ledger. Cassian sits, the weight of his name in his hands, the image of the blue-dressed woman haunting his vision. Helena Valdez's name haunts him like a rumor. He had been told history in soft versions: the charity, the business deals, the occasional awkward handshake at public events. He had never been taught to hold the ledger up to the light. He calls Nathan Cole, his closest lieutenant, the man whose loyalty is the architecture of his safety. Nathan answers like a man who expects orders. Cassian tells him to keep the night taut. He tells him to watch Victoria. The words are measured, but underneath them is something like fear. He has no plan because plans require time, and the melody Julian set loose like a small animal has already slipped into the corridors. Cassian slides the photograph of Helena into his pocket. It is a small, stupid gesture that feels like sacrilege. The man who has always taken everything now cradling a memory. He goes to the window and looks out at the dark hedges. There are paths in that darkness he has never walked. There are people who, if truth arrives like a flood, will be swept away. Amelia sleeps poorly that night, dreaming of wooden floors and a woman's hands, and the sound of a waltz played on a piano long since quiet. The house keeps its secrets in careful rooms. The people who populate it have accustomed themselves to living with the weight of those secrets, but the weight shifts, imperceptibly at first, then with the inevitability of a snowball gathering. In the morning, The portrait of the woman in the blue dress seems to look at the world with a new insistence. The necklace at Amelia's throat is warmer than it was before. Julian returns to his practice, but now brings to his bench a tremor and a resolve. There are pieces of this story he will not let rest. He remembers a name, Raphael Crane, and keeps it like a compass in his memory. The clues have been set in motion. A melody, a portrait, a split necklace, a ledger that smells of oil and old paper. Men in high chairs begin to move their pieces in a game that only some of them understand. In less visible places, women like Amelia shift, as wealthy have always shifted, but now their movements carry a different direction. Outward. By noon, the Blackwell estate hums with a moderated normalcy. The evening's spectacle has been folded into the family myth and the servants' gossip. But under the hum, tangled in corridors and attics and the small boxers of people's lives, a pattern is knitting. Amelia is no longer a single thread in a tapestry. She is a seam that will pull the cloth apart if tugged. If you want to follow what happens next, subscribe. Even as the plea leaves the air like the echo of someone clearing their throat, the house holds its breath. Cassian, who has opened ledgers and broken men with the same indifferent hand, now sits with pages that call his history into question. He has been raised on a truth that the house supplied, but the ledger wants a different story told. He feels it like a pressure at his ribs, a choice, suddenly, into which he has been thrust without training. Rico calls from the narrow kitchen of a modest apartment across town and says he recognizes the melody. He has a photograph that matches the one in the ledger. He remembers Helena as someone who once taught neighborhood children to dance for a small fee and kept a ledger of who owed what. He had always thought the debts paid themselves in goodwill and warm soup. Now he sees names in Victor's ledger that match the names of small shopkeepers who vanished. He calls Amelia and tells her to be careful. Amelia replies with a steadiness that surprises both of them. She has been careful for a long time. Careful is what kept her alive. She also feels a new thing rising. The small, dangerous thought that she is entitled to the truth of her own history. That thought is both terrifying and exquisite. This is the hinge where the night recedes and the day yields consequences. The melody Julian started has become an accusation. The ledger Cassian read is not a relic, but a key. The necklace at Amelia's throat is not jewelry, but evidence. People now move under the weight of knowledge. They do not yet know the magnitude of what will be found, but they know enough to begin to plan, some to conceal, others to reveal. At the edge of things, Victoria tidies her face and sharpens her intent. She will see an opportunity where others see disorder. She alerts certain men who do not ask why. They know they are useful and will be given orders to make useful things happen. She believes in cleaning a house by picking at its loose shingles. In the hallways, conversations change. Getting what one wants becomes a matter of rearranging what another stands on. Amelia finds herself inexplicably calm in the days that follow. People expect tearful vengeance, or a craven exit, or a return to the quiet steps of a life made small. She does not give them that satisfaction. She speaks little, answers less. She reads old ledgers Rico brings like a student trying to decode a dead language. Together, in cheap chairs at a back alley cafe, they map the names they find, properties, shell companies, the small charitable fronts that had an unspoken habit of redirecting funds. Each piece fits a little and forms a picture that is uglier than she had expected. Her grandmother's bakery contract signed over, the deed of a small dancers' hall absorbed into a company with Edward Blackwell's initials scrawled like an ownership brand. She thinks about revenge with the practical clarity of someone who understands consequences. The ledger is a weapon and a hand grenade. If she throws it up too soon, it will take people she cares about with it. If she'll bury it and nurse a private vengeance, she risks becoming what she most feared, a person who would trade principle for satisfaction. And somewhere in the house, Cassian sits with the ledger under his palm and finds his own calculus. He could expose the truth and force a wound that might heal only with blood. He could crush the ledger into ash and keep the house whole, but at what moral price? He keeps the photograph of Helena in his pocket as if carrying the weight of a child's sin. He walks the corridors with a new, private agitation. He hears his father's voice in the margins and feels the old ache of being the son of a man who had a private battle with conscience and lost. So the pieces wait, arranged like an apparatus. The melody waits to be named. The necklace waits to be explained. The painting waits to have its provenance traced. The ledger waits to be interpreted in courtrooms and in headlines, in defense counsel, and in prosecutors' hands. No one is yet ready to strike. Plans begin to form in the dark. Alliances are considered, sometimes in the soft voice of menace, sometimes in the quieter language of redemption. Amelia sits at a tiny table in the back of the cafe and watches people pass, as if the world were suddenly a stage where everyone else had taken parts without asking her permission. She thinks of the first step Helena taught her. She thinks of how a single motion can change the dance. She thinks of mercy and of the kind of power that builds instead of destroys. She knows she will have to choose not only what to do with the ledger, but what she will become in the shaping of grief. The choice is hers. But choices have consequences, and consequences have their own economy. The ledger's existence has already made them all vulnerable. It has made Cassian mortal in a way he was not before. It has given Victoria a new hunger. It has given Julian evidence, and Rico a reason to move from searching to planning. It has made Amelia not simply a survivor but a claimant. The house hums with potential energy. The waltz that began as humiliation has, by its very performance, opened a long locked door. The moment the final chord faded, something in the architecture of power shifted a fraction. The repercussion will not be instant. It will take time. Council rooms, lawyers, the patient scraping of truth from beneath varnish. Evidence will be gathered. Statements will be corroborated. The ledger will be made public or kept private. Each path leads to different forms of justice and different kinds of pain. In the study, Cassian slides the ledger into a secure drawer. He does not yet know whether he will use it or destroy it. He thinks of his father's face and feels suddenly that Victor's last acts were not only greed but fear that their name might rot if truth came to light. The complexity of the men he loves and hates makes the ledger heavier. For the first time, he senses that his father was not simply a villain but a man stuck between crises and cowardice. When he calls Nathan again, his voice is low. "Do not let Victoria make any moves without telling me," he says, "and get a lawyer." Quietly. "Always," Nathan replies. Outside, a car door slams in the lane. Amelia exhales and puts her hand to the necklace. She thinks of Helena's kitchen floor and the way the sun caught dust motes and made them holy. The memory steadies her like a prayer. It would be convenient, in a novel way, if lives could be reset, like an arrhythmia, corrected with a pillow ledger burned, a family exiled, a foundation signed into existence overnight. But this is not fiction that indulges purity of instant change. Real life is slow. It is the long, bureaucratic excavation of truth behind mountains of polite denial. The slow work is how she will wage her claim. Even now, though, there are small acts that shift the topsoil. Julian writes notes to an old colleague at the conservatory. Rico reaches out to a former parish lawyer and gets a name. A prosecutor in the city recognizes a pattern in an unrelated file and makes a call. Cassian walks through the house like a man waking to a different reality, fumbling for the courage to be more than a son of inherited lies. And Amelia! She begins, quietly, to plan with the pragmatic stubbornness of someone who learned to survive through small, consistent acts. She meets Rico at noon. They whisper over coffee in the back room of a church that smells of old lemon oil and wax, and they begin to map a strategy. Confirmations first, legal counsel second, public exposure only when collateral harm can be minimized. The ledger is an ember. They will not throw it into the tinder and watch the house burn. They will fan it into light where it cannot be ignored. Walking home through the alleys, Amelia thinks of the waltz and how the first shift was a single step. She thinks about choices, and about a kind of power that converts grief into public good. She thinks about the academy Helena had once dreamed of in Low. Cautious Santos, a place where any child could learn to dance free of cost. If the Blackwell fortune had been propped on stolen claims, perhaps those funds could be Perhaps a house built on theft could, with the right kind of pressure, be refashioned into something that repaired. She allows herself a dangerous hope, one that is not naive, but deliberate, that a stolen empire could be converted into restitution. The ledger in Cassian's study begins to vibrate with potential, like a string in a wind tunnel. He feels the vibration to his bones. He could deny it. He could hide it. Or he could face the ledger and let it teach him to do better. If the house is to be reshaped, it will require more than exposure. It will require courage from those born into its comforts and resolve from those who had been pushed to the margins. Amelia knows this, because she has lived both the margins and the middle. She understands what it takes to stand up and say, "I am owed," and also the price of being the person who demands payment from a house that could be made to serve more people. The first act is finished, the waltz has been danced, the melody recognized, the ledger found. But a story is not a single loop of music. It is a line that must be pulled taut, a knot that must be wound. Pieces will move. People will decide. And in the quiet of his study, Cassian closes the ledger and knows, for the first time since he was a boy, that his father's legacy is not only wealth, but decisions that harmed Eno. He tastes both betrayal and a sudden, cold obligation to repair. He pictures his father in a hospital bed, a man who had once tried and failed. He feels anger and an unnameable compassion, mingled and confusing. Outside, Amelia presses the crescent at her throat and thinks of Helena's hands and the smell of jasmine. She moves through the days like one learning to turn the grief into a map, to mark the places where she can intervene and the places she must simply witness. She keeps the ledger's future in her pocket like a secret.
The house waits. The players orient.
The twist, simple, brutal, plausible, has been incipient since the first chord. It will not be sudden and it will not be beautiful. It will be messy and legal and public and slow. But it will be real. And somewhere a music box in an old shop begins to play the same melody, the one that tied Helena to Raphael and Helena to the small dancing hall where girls learn to hold their heads high. The world, for just a breath, feels as if it could be different. The music box's faint melody fades into the evening like a secret exhaled. It leaves the house unsettled, as if something in the plaster itself has been rearranged. Victoria reads that atmosphere like a ledger. She records its value and decides how to capitalize. For her, the waltz was never merely entertainment. It was potential leverage. Now that a seam has opened in the Blackwell cloth, she will press until it splits. She moves with the precision of someone who has grown used to making increments of advantage. Margaret is the slowlicious point. Matriarch, beloved. The family's public hunch in sand. Therefore, the most useful hostage for quiet pressure. Victoria arranges a meeting with a courier who knows how to make people go silent and a driver with hands that don't ask questions. She writes no grand speeches. She prefers to keep sentences short and instructions shorter. Keep the public narrative steady, she tells her men. Keep the cameras fed lies, and keep the old woman safe enough to trade. Margaret is taken one night from a luncheon in a private suite. There is no dramatization, no gunfire in the hall, no trembling hostage photos. She is led out under the pretense of a call, guided into a waiting car by a familiar helper. Years of service and trust make the moment as simple as guiding a chess piece. Margaret goes because she would not refuse a request from family. She goes because in that house, small favors build trust. Victoria's men watch the cameras and the papers for the hour when panic is likely to produce mistakes. Then they breathe and wait. When Margaret's absence is discovered, the house's confidence fractures. Cassian hears the news like a physical shove. He knows the calculation. Victoria wants to create an emergency that forces his hand push him to reveal the ledger, to move against perceived enemies, to panic. He thinks of Margaret's hands folding in her lap, of the small tremor she has when remembering names. He imagines her in a dim room, perhaps frightened but dignified, and the image drives him to the phone. He calls Nathan, then Rico, then Amelia. Amelia listens to Cassian's first frantic attempts at control and feels the old current of cold responsibility. An incident like this is a lever under which people get crushed. She has no intention of becoming collateral. She refuses, though, to be used as a pawn for other people's power plays. She hears Cassian's voice and the ledger's weight in his words, and for a moment she thinks of Helena's kitchen of Argumus, held for dignity and the way small. People gathered courage to protect one another. She tells Cassian to listen, to breathe, to not let Victoria shape his response. And then she leaves the cafe and begins to plan. Rico does the practical thing. He calls an old contact, a woman at the Diocesan Coalition who once worked neighborhood watches and once, quietly, helped find a missing girl. She has lines into communities that the corporate security teams do not. Nathan mobilizes what he can inside the housemen, who answer to a family but are not entirely blind. Cassian, for the first time since the ledger was discovered, uses his position to call in favors of a different kind. He asks for police cooperation without pretense. He authorizes searches, and he signs off on a small but critical warrant that allows the local force to pursue a lead in a disused industrial quarter near the river. Victoria thinks she has contained everything. She does not anticipate that Cassian will, for once, act without the protective armor of denial. She believes she can trade Margaret for control of the board, for the removal of Cassian as the public face of change. She does not imagine the people who keep watch in the margins Edico, who remembers faces, Nathan, who has learned the routes of the crews they hire, Amelia, who knows the city, in a register of thrift shops and subway exits where you can be invisible. They find the warehouse by the margin of a lucky break and the work of people who do not sleep in polished offices. A woman at the coalition recognizes a truck pattern. A security team spots a phone ping against a known burner. The warrant slaps down like a blade. It is a narrow window. If they move too early, Victoria will move Margaret and make the rescue impossible. If they move too late, she will engineer a spectacle that fractures the house publicly and splinters Cassian's newfound conscience into private shards. They decide to move at dawn. The plan is quick. Nathan on the perimeter, Rico on the entry. Amelia as the person, Margaret recognizes she will be the voice. Cassian insists on accompanying them as if his presence can right the scales he has unbalanced. He is not the man of gratuitous cruelty tonight, but a man made blunt by ledger lines, and in his eyes there is a strain Amelia has not seen. Fear braided with determination. He wants to fix what the house broke. The air at the river is cold. The warehouse stands hulking and obscene against the dawn, lit by sodium lamps and the reflective blink of puddles. They move with surgical calm. Rico slips a crowbar. Nathan sends a silent hand signal. Amelia breathes in the smell of diesel and old boxers. The world constricts into the work that must be done. They breach the side door. The sound is a small, mechanical concession. Inside, the place smells of damp cardboard, of wood, and the iron temps that a building keeps when it has been used for wrong things. Amelia's boots are quiet. She counts breaths like someone reciting steps. The lighting is poor. Only a strip of clouded skies slides through a high window. Voices spill from an inner room na baschetta, then a woman's voice humming a hymn Margaret, perhaps, trying to keep herself small. They move through shadows and find a cordoned-off area. A chain keeps one set of doors shut. Nathan slides a small blade and cuts it. In the narrow corridor behind the chain, they see folding chairs and the glimmer of a teapot. A table is set as if for a modest meal left in haste. Margaret sits in a chair, hands folded, a shawl around her shoulders. She looks up as if expecting someone to tidy the room. Margaret's first look is not fear, but acute recognition. She sees Amelia and squints, then smiles like someone waking from a short sleep. Her hand finds Amelia's as if claiming a familiar comfort. There is no theatrical rescue cry. A man in a trucker's cap, one of Victoria's men, moves in the doorway as if to press the situation down. Nathan names them and steps forward as a shadow falls over the man. The rescue is not tidy. There are men who will do dirty work for a family, and they have been paid well. They move with the roughness of men who have been told the moral reach of their orders is limited. Someone lunges. Someone yells. Rico strikes a lamp and the dimness becomes chaos. Present tense sharpens around them. Nathan fires a short warning. A man brandishes a crowbar. Cassian steps between two men and speaks the name of a lieutenant. He is not sure of the rules of the fight. He is a son of marble halls. Not a soldier but in the melee. He acts like a person who will not stand by and let a woman he loves be used as a bargaining chip. A man swings. Cassian moves. The blow that was meant for his shoulder finds the slope of his chest. He falls odd and heavy as a statue toppled, hands opening in that almost childish way of someone unconsciously flailing for purchase. When the gun goes off, sound becomes simple and monstrous. There is a flash, the hot smell of burnt powder, someone cursing in a language of quick breath. Cassian collapses with a small sound that makes Amelia's chest break like glass. He is not theatrically noble. He is shock and blood and a collapse that is utterly human. In the scramble that follows, the captors flee. Someone binds and gags a man to keep him from making a phone call. The police arrive late, but carrying a warrant, and take the remaining men in cuffs. They get Margaret out on a stretcher of dignity rather than drama. She murmurs, always with that small iron dignity, that she is not harmed and that the house is on fire for reasons she will not let consume everyone without names. Cassian lies on the warehouse floor for a long minute, his breath shallow and wrong. Amelia kneels and puts both hands over his ribs. The warm smear of blood is a new kind of ledger. He is shot through the side. The bullet will do damage that will lift him into a hospital bed and the thin line of recovery. In the ambulance, Amelia allows the world to fold into her like a bad map. She watches Cassian as they ride his eyes half closed. A small line of pain across his brow and feels the tremor of gratitude at the fact that someone she once feared had chosen to save her. It is complicated gratitude. It is tangled with 100 other things. He will be righted or he will not. That is not for her to know in the moment. She has other things pressing at her. The evidence they took from Victoria's men. The packets Nathan recovered. Rico's USB that he swore contained accounts linking the ledger to shell companies and shipping. Manifest things that would connect Blackwell assets to fronts used for swapping human lives and laundering money. At the hospital, Cassian is stitched and scanned. He is brave in the way of people who have had to hold faces still for photo opportunities. He is smaller without the armor. Amelia rides in a tiny folding chair by his bed. His cheek is pale and clean, and when he opens his eyes, he looks at her like someone seeing a map for the first time and realizing he has been walking in circles. I should be the one to pay, he says, voice small and rough.
I should have.
No, Amelia interrupts because she has no time for the ritual blame that straightens itself into neatness. You did what you could. It is a half. He did what he could in that moment. He also presided over the house that allowed the ledger to grow teeth. The medial truth sits like a stone between them. She knows it. He knows it. But those are things for later. Here, in the fluorescent hush of the ward, action matters more than absolution. Rico slips into the chair behind her. He has the USB, a small packet with transcripts, and Margaret's calm insistence that she will speak when she is steady. He also carries an old, dog-eared envelope that Raphael Crane had once mailed to Julian before he died, a letter Julian had hidden, folded tight in the lining of a coat. Julian had given it to Rico when he realized its significance. A line, perhaps carelessly written, that mentions a child and a promise. It is the kind of paper that, held by the right hands, becomes a constellation. They make choices with the practice of people who have lived with little to spare. Amelia could make the ledger public tomorrow. She could throw it into the press and watch the Blackwell edifice disintegrate in a single, glorious ruin. The satisfaction would be immediate. The collateral would be terrible. 1,000 workers would lose their jobs. Many innocents, beyond the family maids, drivers, suppliers would suffer. The criminal network that Elena Valdez had once sheltered would be smashed. Yes, but it would also become a hulking thing with no one to shepherd the survivors. Lives are not reset like chess pieces. Amelia learned that in the cheap chairs of courtrooms and in whispered phone calls with frightened friends. She remembers the ledger's logic. Exposure is a tool. Use it poorly and you become an instrument of more damage. She remembers Helena's lesson about the first step. She remembers the smell of jasmine and the memory of a dance that was made to give, not to take. She finds herself thinking of transformation in the language of policy and law. Witness protection for survivors. A civil suit to freeze assets. a settlement to fund restitution and the rebuilding of a cultural center that Helena had envisioned. Julian comes to the hospital with his small velvet pouch. He sits in the plastic visitor chair and rests his hands on the surface of the table as if petitioning it. In the pouch is the other half of the crescent. Amelia's necklace was not costume at all, but a relic split in 2 decades earlier. He unfolds the letter from Raphael and lays it on the table. The letter is warm and wrong in its neatness. "If anything happens to me, keep her safe," Raphael had written. "She is our blood." The signature is a looping, stubborn scrawl. Julian speaks carefully. He remembers Helena's hands, the way she had woven the melody into the children's lessons. He remembers a night of a small quarrel between Raphael and Edward Blackwell. When Edward spoke like a man who expected history to always answer to his pen, Julian will testify to what he remembers. He will say that Raphael's letters mention an illegitimate child hidden from the house's public narrative, and that the necklace was a promise between 2 families. It is a chain of testimony, not a single stark claim. But chains are what they build in courts. The necklace halves, the letter, Julian's memory, Rico's USB, Cassian's ledger. These are not sensationalist strokes. They are documentary proof that can be verified. They can be fingerprinted, cross-checked, dated. They can stand up in a courthouse. Cassian, in his hospital bed, finally acts in a way that seems on the level of repentance rather than calculation. He sits upright in doctor's orders and signs a form that authorizes counsel to hand over the safe's ledger and the materials he has found to the prosecutor. He calls his lawyer and orders cooperation. He also calls a PR advisor, not to spin, but to arrange a staged confession he can handle once the legal process allows. To preface his public testimony with an admission that he was his father's son in choices as well as blood. It is an ugly thing to do publicly, but he does so because he has come to see that the ledger's exposure will require a face willing to tell truths. The prosecutor moves with the glacial speed and the cautious certainty of an institution used to balancing cause and effect. A grand jury is convened, evidence is checked, authenticated, corroborated. The investigators follow paper trails to offshore accounts and to the names of men who had disappeared and whose businesses had been transferred into shell corporations. Rico's USB proves a pivot. Invoices for transport routed through a cold storage company that describes itself as a logistics firm. Their money trail links to a small network that used to deliver items for Edward Blackwell's interior designers and now had invoices that, when cross-referenced, matched dates of disappearances. It takes months. Amelia learns patience with the kind of authority she never had before. Legal patience. She sits in police stations and answers questions. She points out faces that she recognizes. She signs affidavits. She refuses to be sensational. She wants the truth to be used as a tool for rehabilitation, not as a vendetta that might fracture the lives of people under the house's roof who were unwitting middlemen. Victoria, stripped of her quick confidence by the legal vice, makes mistakes. She tries to flee the country and is intercepted at a private airstrip. Men who worked for her provide testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. The public narrative is messy, as promised. Not everything is neat, and neatness would be a lie. The city watches the Blackwell estate with a mixture of schadenfreude and anxiety. The newspapers demand pictures. The TV morning shows call for answers. Amelia refuses to be drawn into spectacle. She understands the political theater and refuses to feed it. Cassian's fall into the hospital and his public cooperation produce a fissure in the family's power structure. Senior executives are removed temporarily pending inquiries. The company's board is convened under duress. Investors ask questions about reputational risk. The court puts injunctions on certain transfers. Lawyers on both sides begin to speak the language of settlements and of fiduciary duty. In private rooms, advisors whisper about converting assets rather than destroying them. Amelia and Rico meet with a small, earnest team. A public interest lawyer, a survivor advocate, and a former judge who has agreed to help set up a legal strategy that will minimize collateral harm while ensuring heavy consequences for the men who trafficked and profited. They map out a threefold plan. criminal prosecution of the people who organize trafficking and violence, civil suits to freeze and reclaim assets improperly acquired, and a public development plan to redirect certain funds into restitution and long-term survivor support. Under court supervision, the negotiations are brutal in their bureaucratic pace. The Blackwell legal team, now with Cassian's reluctant cooperation, fights over valuations and the definition of illegally acquired. The public relations outlets kaleidoscope daily. Cassian, aloof from the media, goes through interviews with the prosecutor's team behind closed doors. He signs affidavits where he admits to knowledge of suspicious transfers. In other sworn statements, he names Edward Blackwell's schemes, citing dates and ledger entries. He testifies to the night his father argued about redirecting funds and the smudged annotation that read, "If discovered, remove Victor." Victoria's trial is public. The prosecutor lays out the network, the shell companies, the shipping invoices, the testimonies of men moved by money, and the courtroom listens with a mixture of moral shock and the patience of a legal audience. Lawyers on both sides call witnesses. Julian testifies to his own memory of Raphael, and the letter becomes an artifact in court. The necklace halves are entered as evidence. A forensic analyst traces the metal's patina to an old maker that had done work in the Valdez Quarter. Handwriting analysis on Raphael's letter supports its authenticity. When Cassian appears to testify, he looks small because his usual armor is something substantial that made him seem larger than he was. He reads with a voice that is steady because he has chosen the steadiness of repair. He speaks of ledger entries and dates and the decisions that were made at a boardroom table. He confesses that money took precedence over people, that legacy became a ledger. His testimony is not made to absolve him. It is meant to cut open the house and let light into rooms that have been dark for a very long time. The process is painful for all involved. Not all criminals are taken to prison. Some are acquitted on technicalities, others plea bargain. The system is imperfect, but the key architects, men who had habitually moved people as commodities, are indicted. Assets are frozen pending civil proceedings. The news cycles whirl. Amelia reads articles with a professional calm and a personal ache. She thinks of Helena's voice again. Dancing doesn't live in your feet. It lives in your soul. The law may grind slowly, but the soul must have somewhere to lean. Behind the headlines, they do the slow work, outreach to survivors, safe housing for those who left the illegal networks, counseling programs funded by emergency grants, and modest reparations to families. Amelia insists that any settlement include independent oversight, a board composed of survivor advocates, financial auditors, and community representatives. She will not be the sole public face of this work. She wants it to be accountable and to outlast any one person. The public trust will not be rebuilt by celebrity gestures. The negotiations ultimately result in a court-mediated settlement. A portion of the Blackwell holdings are restricted and placed into a trust with strict oversight. Certain businesses are ordered to be liquidated and the proceeds funneled into victim restitution and community development. And a fund is created to seed a nonprofit entity, the Helena Valdez Foundation, tasked with long-term survivor support and the creation of a dance academy in the Valdez neighborhood. It is slow, it is bureaucratic, it is enormous. The foundation structure deliberately prevents a single person from taking unilateral control. The board includes 3 survivors, a forensic accountant, Julian as an artistic advisor, and an independent civil rights attorney. The court appoints a monitor to ensure compliance with the settlement. Cassian signs his name to the papers that relinquish certain controls, an act of legal surrender that for him functions like a public penance. The Blackwell family remains wealthy. They are not ejected into poverty, but they are constrained, and their fortune is redirected to repair. Some will say the court was merciful. Others will say it was prudent. Amelia thinks neither. She calls the process deliberate. People misread acts like hers as magnanimous because she does not pursue petty revenge. They forget that prudence is hard and that transformation requires the peculiar kind of patience that sits through depositions and reads through exhibits. Amelia sits through both with a quiet ferocity. She wants to change the terms of what power buys. She wants the money to do what money should do in the hands of people who have been harmed by its misuses: fund, rescue, provide education, sustain long-term care. Cassian, in the months after his operation, goes to therapy and classes on ethics in business, on non-profit governance, on cultural humility. He speaks in community forums, not as a man seeking absolution, but as one trying, awkwardly and late, to do better. He insists that the Blackwell name will not be erased. Rather, its resources will be repurposed. He sits in meetings with survivors and asks questions he had never been taught to ask. People watch him with suspicion, with anger, with cautious hope. It will not be enough for many, and Amelia knows this. The work is not about erasing blame, but about bending resources into repair. 1 year from the night of the dance, on a day that is warm and fragile as new skin, the Helena Valdez Foundation throws open the doors of its small but luminous academy. The building is a refurbished warehouse in the Valdez Quarter. The paint is warm. The dance floor is polished oak, reclaimed from a community center that had once served summer dances. The academy's sign is modest, bronze letters on a ribbon of dark wood, and underneath it, in smaller type, reads, "For dance, dignity, and the work of repair." The opening is not a scene of triumphalism. It is a gathering of people who have been through cold rooms and long legal filings and who have held on to the knowledge that something good could grow from the work of undoing. Survivors sit in the front rows. Julian presides over a small quartet that plays the melody transformed now into something steady and warm. There are speeches, measured, honest. Margaret, her figure, smaller but luminous, in a shawl of hand-stitched fabric, stands and speaks in a voice that trembles with age and steel. She remembers Helena. She remembers bread and music and the way a woman's hand can teach a child to plant her feet and take the first step. Amelia stands at the back of the room because she does not want the attention that will smear the day into spectacle. People come to her anyway. Old neighbors, children who have been given scholarships by the foundation, dancers who once had no place to practice. She looks out over the floor. Her bod remembers the first waltz, not as a humiliation, but as an inciting force, and feels the slow certainty that she had wanted. The academy is not only a building, it is a map of choices enacted over time. Cassian arrives late. The months have changed him in ways that are visible and invisible. There is a thinness to the lines around his mouth, and there is a new steadiness in the way he folds his hands. He will never be free of the family's history, nor should he be. He has learned the cost of that inheritance. He stands in a corner and watches the room, which has the gentle chaos of a community gathering. He applauds at the right moments, and then retreats to the side, where Amelia notices him and catches his eye. He walks toward her. They speak briefly, and not to any reporters. He listens more than he speaks. The academy hums with small conversations, with the clack of shoes on floor. Amelia hears the melody again, the one Julian coaxed back into public life, and she thinks of Helena's words about the soul. The music is no longer a trap or a test. It is a practice. "I wanted to destroy it all," Cassian says, voice low, at first. And then she asks, "And then I thought about the people who would fall through the cracks. I thought about how revenge would be a language that only teaches pain. I thought about how my father used his fear as an excuse." His voice tightens. "I chose to try to do better. It is a small confession. It is a necessary one." Amelia listens. She has been forged by harder things than confessions. She has decided that rebuilding requires more than punishment. It requires the deliberate refashioning of resources. She finds it a difficult thing to do. The memory of pain is not dissolved by good intentions, but intent, over time, yields policy. They stand on the threshold of the new studio with a crowd of volunteers behind them. A child with pigtails tugs on Amelia's sleeve and asks if she will dance. Amelia kneels and takes the girl's small hands and lifts her into a turn that is safe and bright. The girl's laugh is a bell. Cassian watches. Maestro Julian steps forward and takes up his violin. He draws the melody no longer as accusation but as an offering. The crowd settles into silence that is clean as a held breath. Cassian extends his hand to Amelia with a cautious formality that is both personal and symbolic. There is no romantic flourish. There is a mutual understanding that they have been part of a long and devastating story and now must be part of something slower, kinder, and built to last. Amelia places her gloved hand in his. They step onto the floor. The dance that the Academy will teach is not theatrical spectacle. It is practice, discipline, and the slow reclaiming of dignity. The first measures of the waltz are careful. Amelia uses the rhythm to keep pace. Cassian follows as someone learning new instructions. The camera of the opening day captures the scene not as a love story, but as a public moment of repair. People watch, some with tears, some with the tight smile of someone who knows the cost. They turn. Their bodies are not in perfect harmony. They do not need to be. The measure between them holds the memory of what was and the intention of what will be. The melody slides through the hall like a thread. The child with pigtails claps when it ends. A woman from the neighborhood stands and shouts, "Bravo!" There is laughter. There is applause. After the ceremonial dance, Helena's necklace sits, two halves reunited at Lestrests, in a small velvet box on a table near the doorway. Julian places it there. Amelia has decided to leave it in the public trust rather than wear it herself. The necklace will be a symbol inside the Foundation's archive, to remind people of lineage, loss, and recovery. It is not spectacle. It is a record. The Academy's work expands slowly. Grants trickle in. The Foundation develops vocational programs, legal aid clinics, job training partnerships, counseling services, and scholarships. Survivors find shelter, and some find work in running the Academy. Teaching, administrating, mentoring. They are paid consciously, and their voices are structural, not token. The Foundation funds are overseen by the board and by a court-appointed auditor for the first 5 years. Cassian sits on no supervisory committee. He devotes his energies to an internal program that supports small business development in affected neighborhoods. He is not the hero of the story. He is a man who, with difficulty, is trying to live differently. Romance does not bloom like a movie plant. There are moments of tenderness and long silences that speak better than words. Amelia and Cassian have reactions to one another that are not simple. They are wary, and hobbled habits of distrust range themselves into places where affection could be. Cassian goes to group therapy workouts and listens to people he had once dismissed. Amelia gives public talks and then stays home to write letters to kids in the Academy who want to know where they came from. Trust is earned. It is not automatic. A year gives them enough time to make changes that can be tracked. The court's settlement required a reformation of certain Blackwell business practices, independent audits, moral clauses and contractor agreements, a restructuring that ensured money for restitution. Several men who organized trafficking rings are in prison. Others are under investigation. The Foundation's first annual report arrives with small numbers and large intention. 50 survivors in direct services the first year. Scholarships for 30 kids. Partnerships with local shelters and a long-term plan for housing assistance. On a quiet afternoon, months after the opening, Amelia wanders into the Academy's studio when no one else is there. Light falls across the oak floor in a broad strip. She closes her eyes and thinks of Helena's hands, of the kitchen's wooden groove, of the first step. She feels a hand on her shoulder and turns. It is Cassian. He does not move like a man expecting to perform. He stands close enough to be present without breathing into her space. "Do you ever regret it?" he asks, voice soft, not taking the ledger and burning them all down. Amelia thinks of the victims who might have been harmed in an indiscriminate revenge, of the families who would have lost pensions, of children who would have been orphaned again by the sudden collapse of the very institutions intended to help them. She thinks of the first step Helena had taught her and of how power can be turned into light. "I regret a lot," she says, and the sentence is a small honest thing. But not that. Revenge is a quick song. "I wanted a steady hymn." He nods and looks at the floor. For a long moment, nothing is said. Then he takes her hand, this time without formality, and they walk together to the center of the room. He asks if she will show him the steps again, not as a spectacle, but as an act. She lifts her chin and begins. Their feet find the count, imperfect and forgiving. Around them, the academy breathes. Children tumbling into laughter, volunteers moving chairs, Julian's bow on a violin drawing quiet music from a marked place. When the dance ends, it is not an exclamation. It is the closing of a practice session. They leave the floor and emerge into a sun that does not promise everything, but does promise a day in which more can be done. The twist that no one saw coming, the revelation of stolen lineage and a family's appropriation, was not a dramatic lightning bolt that rewrote the world in an instant. It was a series of small recognitions laid like pebbles across a river. A melody remembered, a portrait, two halves of a necklace, a letter folded in a coat, and a ledger whose ink finally dried the way truth does when left exposed. Those things combined to demand accountability. What followed was ugly, legal, and human. Arrests, court hearings, bargaining work that takes patience. And the greater twist, the one that matters to Amelia, was not simply that she had been an heir in a line of property and name. The larger unexpectedness was that she could turn a wound into a purpose that reached beyond her own retribution. She could convert anger into an infrastructure of care. That was the twist nobody saw coming. The old house, yielding not ruin but restitution. A damaged inheritance remade into a resource for repair. That was the kind of twist that changes systems rather than merely satisfying a private vengeance. One evening, months after the academy's opening, Amelia goes to the small archive room where papers live under careful plastic. The necklace rests in its box. Julian visits often and brings notes and fragments, programs, old music, a faded photograph of Raphael at a piano. Amelia traces the line of a photograph with a fingertip until she understands how small things anchor big truths. Cassian comes by then, too. He brings stories from the meetings and boardrooms where lawyers now talk with a different caution. He brings a patient, human regret. He brings, in his own slow way, an apology. Not a grand speech, just a small stewardship of the consequences he had inherited. They do not marry and move to the country. They do not erase the past. They are both older, and so they act with the practice of people who have tasted and survived too much. Their love, if love is the word, grows in the margins. In shared grief, in shared work, in the way two people can hold the same instrument and not play it the same way. It is not the tidy denouement of a romantic plot. It is the persistent presence of two people who have been bound by a shared failure and a shared resolve. At the end of the year, on another opening night, this time for a community recital at the Academy, Amelia steps forward and addresses the small crowd with a voice that is steady and not showy. She speaks about the work of teaching children to dance and the deeper work of learning how to claim life without allowing bitterness to strip you of future joy. She does not preach. She tells a short story of Helena's hands, the smell of jasmine, and the first step. The room listens in that private, public way. Afterwards, when the guests shift into the warm night and the chandeliers, they once known, seem a long lifetime away. Cassian asks if she will dance. There are no cameras trained on them. The moment is private in its publicness. They take the small raised floor in the Academy's courtyard, the same steps that had started the undoing of a legacy. They move slowly, not because they must, but because one step requires another. The final chord of the night is not a flourish. It is simply a decision enacted in movement to keep the work going, to rebuild in the long, careful corridors of law and community, and to let a music that once sounded like accusation become, at last, a practice of dignity. If this story moved you, share a moment where you chose forgiveness or transformation.